I first saw Simon and Garfunkel down in San Diego at the Civic Auditorium when they were new then, and they were popular, but they weren't big stars. And I was surprised that they would come out with just a stool and one microphone and one light, and they performed for like 2 hours. And I keep thinking of things having to be, lights going off, and dancers and singers. But and the sound I thought was kind of funny at the beginning, but you get very used to the fact that it's just a guitar and 2 voices, and then you become mesmerized by just that lack of things going on. It was just the concentration of them together, and it was absolutely wonderful. And so when they were on my show, I was hoping that I could sing a song with them, and we picked Scarborough Fair, and again, singing with my brothers made it very easy.
Hello there, welcome to Weird Music on the Glumberger channel. Strange music show with a really weird presenter looking at odd albums of all sorts of different shapes and sizes, Odd peculiar reviews that for the most part don't really make much sense. So today we've got more of the incomprehensible with a look at, another noise album essentially, released on cassette, something we've been looking at an awful lot recently, but I don't know, it's like the noise genre is just really piquing my curiosity recently. But to be fair, this is a very interesting release in my books, at roughly 75 minutes in length. This is just a constant battering onslaught of never-ending noise that does shift the morph around across that lengthy runtime and does some very interesting things with the genre. It's also kind of funny for a bunch of reasons, but also rather somber and humbling as well, which I was later to learn, which we'll learn about later in the video. So let's just get into it then. Today I present Cherries by Stable. And so, of course, let's ask ourselves, who is Stable? Well, Stable is the moniker for one Andy Brown, a noise artist from Edinburgh, Scotland, and owner of the very strange record label Venalism, which is essentially an incredibly strange outlet for some of the strangest, noisiest, and or weirdest albums that I've come across. A really exciting label that I'm very glad to have discovered. And so Stable is essentially the outlet for Brown, himself, offering unrelenting noise across, many different releases. And so, what is Cherries then? Well, Cherries is a 2020 album from Stable, released on Venalism as its 7th official release. And what we have here is, essentially a very weird, noisy, and oddly funny album of pure noise, presented to us with a picture of Simon and Garfunkel smiling at the camera with the album's title, of course. And so, when looking at it, you might want to convince yourself that on the inside is something as lovely as all of this presentation suggests. But no. Cherries is essentially 75-minute onslaughts of constantly occurring noise that builds and builds with this ferocious intensity, just adding more to the chaos with these never-ending loops, it seems. It's a completely unforgiving album, and one I'm very excited to discuss today. But before we start though, I would like to quickly mention though that in preparation for this very video, I reached out to Andy Brown to discover a bit more about Stable, a bit more about the album Cherries, and a bit more about the record label Venalism. And to my pleasant surprise, got an incredible response back to all my rather inane questions. So, towards the end of this video, we're going to be hearing a lot more from Andy Brown about this very album, as, I wanted to essentially present my entire review as I originally wrote it, which I wrote before contacting Andy Brown. And because there's some interesting parallels, I think, that that I just came up with by myself, and what he explained was very interesting. So more on that later. But without further ado, let's discuss the music, shall we? And so, opening up with part 1. We're getting, a very peculiar rising loop of electronic hums coming into the scene, like the thumping of beats, before giving just enough space for these affected vocal chants, it feels, to come into the various channels of the headphones, sonically overloaded with a peculiar sense of intimidation and intrigue. And to me, I feel like there's something almost militant about it all to begin with, especially with how those loops turn into these almost percussive beats, just pushing the composition along and along. And then, of course, with its incredibly long length, this recording, it's only just getting started, And with how it's all coming across in these opening moments, I feel, I'm reminded a lot of the kind of more noisy, abstract dub moments from the likes of Nod. Something that you might hear on the likes of Showa Lord Now, I don't know how it's said, Showa Lord Nude or something. Or even, to be fair, the incredibly strange recording of Guest Out, which was featured on Bandcamp. Very interesting recording. However, I feel like Stable is creating their own vibe entirely, though. One that utilises the noise genre and combines it with this incredibly long runtime that turns, what you could arguably describe as conventional noise music into a more overloading album experience as a result. Especially with musical loops spinning around ad nauseum, though, just resonating outwards, it just overloads you as you get slow, subtle rises of airy electronic static, it feels. And I like how you kind of get shifts into new different moments, where as it progresses, it kind of goes from these odd moments into sort of resonating pings of electronic frequencies, that completely fade into the background, only to leave the passage of these electronic rises of sound that pulsate into the scene before being accompanied by the echoing resonance of hissing, it feels. And I feel like it's not taken long to get to this point, arguably, in the grand scheme of this very album, of course. But it feels like, especially when you find yourself occupying what is, oddly enough, a different scene within the whole context of it all, though, it feels like we've been here for ages, though, which is so weird because it's all so incredibly long anyway. But yeah, especially with the way you just get these rising airy electronic drones, just pulsating the screen, rising and falling into the noisy static, At its very core, it's just pure noise generation, it feels. But I think there's some lovely structuring to it all. Or at least, lovely in the context of noise music, right? Like, for me, I think it'd be incredibly easy to just generate a tone, a noise, and then let that distortion and feedback ring out for 70 minutes. But I feel like Stable has instead presented something to us that, weirdly enough, has a sort of blurred form in amongst the rising chaos that continually just assaults you, essentially. I'd describe it as a semblance of structure, and almost a narrative that pulls you into this noisy world that is incredibly incomprehensible, don't get me wrong. But I like how subtle the changes on this recording are, though. Different elements do begin to loop, rising in amongst the droning static before starting off quietly before occupying the scene entirely, it feels, leaving behind a wake of, just sounds as we, we're only just beginning to get comfortable with, it feels. And before long, before you've even noticed, the entire landscape has shifted and changed before our very eyes. But the effects to bring us up to this point, have been so subtle in amongst all the noise and chaos that it feels like you barely notice those changes until suddenly our perception of what it is we are hearing becomes aware of how different these very noisy sounds are than what they were 5 minutes ago, if that makes sense. But even so, looping elements, both new and old, they just seem to climb into the scene, adding to the turbulent rising of droning noise, creating a sense of something new and different to comprehend that has a weird sense of familiarity, I must say, in terms of what we're getting used to hearing by this point in the composition. I find it so interesting, as with it being so incredibly long, we have so much time to be comfortable and get used to the strange sound occurrences we are hearing. And the more it develops, the more it starts to feel a bit more turbulent, a bit more chaotic, as the drones rise and rise, bringing in with it more strange and panicked occurrences of tones and frequencies, playing in amongst that deluge of noise. And as weird and as challenging as it all is, I find it to be an oddly enjoyable listen in amongst the noise genre. For me, the particulars of the tones, the noise, whatever is generating those sounds, I think it's oddly comfortable to listen to. Especially when midway into the composition, you start getting a rise of peculiar frequencies, it feels deserved, like the composition has spent more than enough time, to warrant introducing this more anxiety-inducing rise of tones and frequencies. And it continues to make for us this incredibly intense listening experience that feels like being slowly pulled further and further into the eye of the storm as chaos reigns all around you in this one. Becoming oddly industrial at times before that took so incredibly long to get there, of course, isn't it? There's something fascinating about that, I have to say. Something like this is so absurdly, incredibly challenging to listen to, I feel. And I'll be honest, finding the context to sit down and listen to the entirety of this thing, very difficult thing to figure out, especially with it being so long and with being such a manic overloading experience in its own right that uses that incredibly long length of time to just really subtly develop strange sound occurrences that, naturally float into the scene, but they do add to the sense of chaos and distortion when necessary. It just all results in this cataclysmic, never-ending bombardment of noisy drones, and I think it's really fascinating and fun to listen to as a result. Of course, though, there is a second side to this album, of course, don't get me wrong, it's a cassette, of course, and the flipping over that cassette will bring you straight into part 2, which is a 44-minute deluge of industrial noise. And so, there is an immediate difference when this track starts that we can no doubt hear, as alongside those pulsing noises that feel like strobe lights, you're also getting the rhythmic pounding of a drum machine, I think. Just sort of smashing away with this very intimidating beat that resonates in amongst all that distortion and noise. And it creates a rather intense passage that feels even more terrifying than the preceding track. And especially with that constantly occurring beat, we as listeners now have sort of an anchor to hold us in place as that deluge of noise just continues its unholy bombardment. And it becomes a continuing of that sonic overload, And I think by this point, especially for me, we're already so battered, bruised and exhausted by the whole experience. However, with this song, this song being a little bit longer than the previous track, it gives us, more time to just truly get lost in that noisy build-up that is continuing to push forward towards us. And I think it's so fascinating as a result, The peculiar structure, the unrelenting, never-ending occurrences of noise that drill into your very head with peculiar electronic and industrial beats, I think for some reason, this track might just be my favourite from the entire thing. And as well, we get to spend so much time here, and as such, it's weirdly entertaining and fascinating to experience, especially that constantly building deluge. Especially with those beats as well, it feels like the rhythmic drumming of some sort of mystic cult, performing their terrifying human sacrifices, hypnotising you with that drum pattern as you find yourself drawn towards the sacrificial altar as, yes, you are the sacrifice. And that constant bombardment of it all, it just truly amazes me, with the whole thing covering so much ground in a way that is really cohesive within the context of this whole album experience, even as it, expresses it across an incredibly lengthy runtime. And once again, I love the development of all these little different dynamic layers occurring on this particular track, once again, elements so slowly introduce themselves into the scene, starting off, quietly in amongst that noisy mix before dragging themselves into the forefront, subtly changing that landscape once again as the more familiar elements get pushed towards the back. And it becomes, for me, a sort of pull between new things happening in amongst the familiar, and it's kind of confusing as a result. As you're hearing this overloading deluge, you wonder, is this something we've heard before? Is this something new? Very hard to explain, very hard to know. But it feels like it's all constantly developing and growing into this gargantuan composition that just pushes and pushes for that incredible length of time. And I still think, even within the noise genre, which, of course, can be so caustic at times, this is such an oddly enjoyable listening experience, No, for sure there is that element of the abrasive, of the challenging, but with how everything occurs and how the whole thing is mixed as well, it doesn't feel like that loud overload of maximalist tones, but rather a slow building generation of noisy tones. And I think as a result, it's a lot easier to listen to, it's a lot more comfortable, and it becomes this very hypnotising miasma of noise that kind of just, pulls you into this stasis and becomes weirdly oddly relaxing. It's so difficult to explain, I think. But yeah, especially with that occurrence of that constant industrial beat, there is that sense of structure of turning noise into something that does have a shape and form here, even if it is one that is still so blurry, distorted and chaotic. And there is of course the unsettling element of this album, don't get me wrong, but I have to say, it is amongst one of the longest pure noise albums I've listened to, but I still think it's so much more easy to listen to and access than some of the more distorted fuzzy washes of just pure overloading noise that we've heard. Like, something about this particular album is just so interesting and easier to listen to than the vast majority of noise we've covered so far. I mean, to try and discuss it further, this entire composition has been presented to us with the instruction of listening to all in one uninterrupted session. An incredibly demanding request, I would argue, but there's something fascinating about the sonic effects of such an arduous noise experience, and especially on how it affects your very perception of it, if that makes sense. Like, for me, both the compositions sort of change as it progresses onwards, new elements of noise, varying textures, all creating this constantly twirling miasma of the very scene, but with the constant onslaught of never-ending loops, it becomes such a difficult aspect to be aware of when all you're just getting bombarded with is noise after noise after noise. And it becomes really difficult to know is what is actually just the recording, what is literally embedded onto the tape here, and what is just your brain trying to create some context and understanding of what it is you're listening to. What is your brain inventing as a result of hearing it all? Very weird one to try to explain, but I genuinely feel like that hypnotising and never-ending elements presented on this recording just have an effect of warping your very perception, just clouding everything into a confusing, incomprehensible state, which is, difficult to put into words, but I figure with this album being so long, we have more than enough time to try and talk about these things. And try explain it, I just feel like, I'm aware of what I'm hearing, I'm aware of how it sounds, but it's so confusing to know whether I am literally hearing this, or if my brain is just so overloaded, it's just filling in the gaps of what it thinks I'm hearing. Don't know if that makes any sense. to something else I want to talk about as well before we get into our interview. This album, of course, was one of many that I was drawn towards when first checking out the record label Venalism. And it was, of course, without a doubt, the hysterical artwork that sucked me into this, forcing me to need to discover what music was going to be unearthed. So yeah, the picture of Simon and Garfunkel smiling nicely with the album title of Cherries in the middle. I think it's very funny, but also rather fascinating, though, the idea of taking a photo of two very popular songwriters who wrote and performed some of the most beautiful music ever, I feel, where lovely harmonies intertwine into some of the most beautiful instrumental passages. And it feels like here we've been given a bit of a tongue-in-cheek performance, so that might even be a bit of a joke being played on us, the audience. One, seeing this cassette and having no context, for noise music, I guess, you might rightly expect to hear the music of Simon and Garfunkel, right? But no. What we have instead of beautiful acoustic music is just 75-ish minutes of never-ending noise music. An antithesis to the very music Simon and Garfunkel created. I think it's such a bizarre contrast that the album's artwork has created for us, in, making it such a funny yet fascinating listening experience, I feel. And it makes me consider the contrast between what is beautiful and accessible and what is arduous and inaccessible. And to me, as well, just to further go into it kind of reminds me of, the Gerogerigegege kind of thing, where similar to their album Showa, that certainly fooled many people, both with the presidential album cover and the Ramones album cover, where you're kind of having a bit of a joke on the audience through the use of absurdist album covers that don't represent what is being heard, if that makes sense. And I have to say, it certainly works for this, though. Like, I definitely wanted to find out what kind of noise was going to be on this tape. But yeah, I do also love the sense of humour here, though, and I have to say, story time as well. During my time at Arctangent, I was showing this particular cassette to a whole bunch of different people, both friends and people I'd never met before. And one thing that everyone seemed to have in common, was just this, they would see the album of Simon and Garfunkel, the album cover, and then they would just all start laughing. I just think there's something so lovely about that, you're just showing this album, they just start laughing. It's like, what is it? You then tell them it's noise music, and they just go, oh, okay. But yeah, I think a great sense of humour and something really cool about the album. But also, at its very core, weirdly fascinating constant onslaught of ear-battering noise. Completely unrelenting and unforgiving, of course. But, something really cool about it, I think, and, I just think it's amazing, to be fair. And so, as mentioned, right at the beginning, did reach out to Andy Brown to find out more about this strange cassette release. So, as a result, we have a little interview together. And so without further ado, let's discuss this strange noisy album, Andy Brown himself, and this strange esoteric record label of Venalism, right? And so I would also like to add as well, before we get into this interview, the very first question in this interview comes from Venalism's band leader Chad Murray, who I said, "What do you want to know about this album?" And of course, he went straight to the point to actually ask what is going to be on most of our minds, it seems. So without further ado, let's hear from Andy Brown. 1. Why is Simon and Garfunkel on the cover? And what do the Cherries refer to? I didn't really have a specific reason for putting them on the cover, but I like the idea of having something that completely misrepresented what the music sounds like. With a lot of noisy tape releases, you can generally guess what something will sound like before listening. The aesthetics always felt very strict and a bit laboured, but perhaps most folk who buy these tapes want to know what they're going to get, and the folk making the noise want to appeal to a certain demographic community quickly and easily, which results in this homogenization of design. Putting a photo of a sweet young smiling folk duo on the cover instead was me wanting to have a bit of fun and be a bit contrary, plus also sneak in a comment about the staleness of what passes as design within the noisy genre. I also like the idea of putting, in this case, an act that are already known and in the public consciousness, playing with expectations of what is or isn't correct for a front cover, concepts of authorship, and traditional visual signifiers. I called the Cherries because they're my favourite fruit. That was the total amount of thought I put into it. 2. To further add, what is the story behind Cherries, the album? The story behind Cherries is tied to the other releases I made around that time. In late 29, I suffered a seizure that almost killed me. Thankfully, I recovered, and it left me determined to fully commit to the Stable project. Prior to the seizure, I had released a handful of tapes, but I was unsure where to take things. But having what felt like a near miss galvanised me, and I went into high gear, producing 4 releases in a couple of months while I convalesced. 2 releases were focused on my seizure and immediate recovery. The imaginatively named titled Hypoxic Grand Mal Seizure and Hospital Ship. But Cherries wasn't conceived with any referential concept. Instead, it was an exercise I set myself to create a long-form immersive piece that was hypnotic, numbing and grindingly repetitive, but with dynamics that evolve and encroach slowly throughout the piece. I wanted to test the cliche that meditative music must be relaxing. Some of the best hypnotic music I've heard is loud and anxiety-inducing, but if the music sticks to it and keeps going for long enough, a sense of blissful abandonment can be achieved within all the noise and chaos. So that's something like what I was trying to achieve. 3. What is the reasoning for the moniker of Stable? It's meant in a flippant and sarcastic way, but comes from a deeper inquiry into the perception of what stability is. Like, if someone describes themselves as stable, they may think they mean an emotional or psychological term, but it almost always actually refers to a person's finances or social standing. It comes down to what the perceived expectations are of a person and what dictates stability and instability. I began the project when I got sober. My mental health has always been precarious, but it did improve when I stopped abusing alcohol and drugs. I decided to use the word stable for the project because of the incongruity of the perception that now that I had cleaned up, I was now functioning, when in reality the underlying issues were still there. If anything, they were more pronounced now I had a clear head. So yeah, it is meant as a bit of a glib comment on the ridiculousness of saying I'm stable. 4. How long have you been producing music? Stable as a project has been around for around 6 years, I think. I've been involved in other projects and played drums in numerous bands in the past, but Stable has been my primary project in recent years. 5. What is the ethos behind starting Venalism? Fundamentally, it is a creative outlet, a diversion from the mundanity of real life and work. Plus, it's a wonderful way of building connections and supporting other artists who I admire in whatever small way I can. I operate the label outside the strictures of the creative industrial complex. I neither have the cash or the inclination to hire press agents, and marketing the label rarely goes beyond posting on Instagram when a release is made available. Endlessly petitioning for attention on social media and cold calling writers for reviews is a waste of my time as much as it's psychologically exhausting, so I've chosen to remove the label from all of that. I want to ideally keep both Stable and Venalism as creatively beneficial for me personally, and ideologically sincere in general. That means keeping releases affordable, nobody's getting rich here so why jack the price, and available. The whole culture of limited edition releases has always felt a bit odd. If inauthentically, it creates demand and limits accessibility, which comes off as elitist to me. It also leads to price gouging on the resale market. How many times have you seen a limited tape of some notable noise artist being sold for silly money on Discord? I know a lot of labels use this strategy, so I'm probably just a bad salesman or something. I just prefer to keep as many of the label's releases as possible available and cheap so anyone who wants one can get one. That feels more egalitarian to me. What do you look for in potential releases for the label? Honesty, invention, and conviction. Anything that has visceral and elemental energy that is expressed with total resolve. It is hard to pinpoint specifically what would grab me, but there are many things that would put me off. 1. Anything devotedly tethered to genre, including noise power electronic acts. There ain't anything transgressive about pasting the exact same shit White House or Merzbow did 40 odd years ago. 2. Anything racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, and just generally anything bigoted. Transgression is about questioning and destroying old beliefs and long-held noise, not wrapping them in leather and calling them edgy. Fucking dull. 3. Hollow chest-beating machismo. White, bold men invariably bleating about purity. 4. Anything too sterile and self-satisfied in its perceived elevated obtuseness. There needs to be some dirt on it. 5. Anything whimsically, abstract, or calculated in its amateurishness. If it's being made purely to get a rise out of the squares, then it says and signifies nothing. There are likely more things that would turn me on, but those are the main offenders. 7. What made you want to produce noise music? What about the genre drew you in? I've always felt drawn to music that's considered annoying or felt like a challenge. It's what keeps me interested in digging around for more weird, aggro, obnoxious sound, which noise as a blanket term seemed to be almost like the end. It was so final and absolute. It perfectly stripped away everything traditionally considered musical, but still held weight and invention. It demanded and rewarded the listener's concentration. I came to the point where making noise music just made sense. I had played in noisy bands in the past, but they were exercises in compromise and delegation, which after quite a few years have become frustrating. Like I mentioned, I had sobered up, and I was feeling motivated to finally attempt something completely by myself with no restrictions or compromises being applied. It felt like a new start, and I went into it headfirst with absolute glee. 8. What has been the noisiest thing you've ever heard? This will sound really pretentious, like all my answers, sorry, but the sound of the countryside or the outskirts of a city in the middle of the night. The absence of any kind of sound is more deafening than anything else I can think of, especially since I live in a busy city and abuse my ears constantly with horrible noises. 9. What's your favourite release you've made so far? It's a total cliche, but it's always the next one, the one I'm working on. I tend to abandon a release once it's fully finished, with the cover designed and tape produced. I'm usually well into working on the next one by the time it's released. I don't produce for posterity. It's something that needs to be extracted, lanced like a boil. 10. When creating work under the stable moniker, what are you looking to express to your audience? I don't hold any preconception of what anyone might think of the record I make. Nothing I do is done with audience in mind. It's completely self-indulgent. I relate it to like a chronic condition, something that I'm compelled to do as it helps to keep everything in my head and in my life in some kind of order. I attempt to exercise, rather than express, different ideas, concepts and elemental emotions through the noise I make. And if that is relatable to a listener, that's wonderful, but it's not a need of mine to be understood by the listener. When I record vocals, I will write down the words I want to say, but I always throw them away afterwards. They've served their purpose. Plus I smother the vocals in so much processing that they're essentially incomprehensible. If I had something I wanted to directly express to the listener, I wouldn't do that most likely. 11. What are some of your favourite acts or bands? Today, they are The Nausea, Distraxia, Cunt Roaches, The Birthday Party, Puce Mary, Daja Casimira, Casper Grodsman Massacre, Pharmacon, Extra Life, Malfoy, Einsturzen Nerbauten, Sister Iodine, Heejin Zhang, Diamanda Garleth, CBN, AIDS-World, Soft Issues, My Disco, Shushu, Himu Cult, Bride, Church. And so, a huge thanks to Andy Brown for their incredibly comprehensive answers. You know, I'll be honest, I thought my questions wouldn't actually be all that interesting, but I'm actually delighted to have learned so much about the strange album and about the man behind it all. And I have to say, yeah, very amused that my interpretation of the album's front cover, seems to be, mostly on the mark. Though Andy did further explain there being a comment on the staleness of design within the genre. Really fascinating to me. It's also really interesting to learn a lot about Venalism and just about noise music and genre. So, and as well as what it means to Andy Brown himself. So, a huge thanks to you for taking part in this one. I genuinely really appreciate it, and I do hope you, the audience, have enjoyed hearing more from Andy. But yeah, I think with that, we're going to be coming to the end of our episode of Weird Music there. I have to say, we have covered a lot of, unbearable noise tracks, but I don't know, I've been having a lot of fun covering these, and I feel like this one, it kind of falls into the more, accessible, interesting, and fun type of noise music, Kind of more like, the slaughter table of things, where, the actualities of the composition, are often fun and exciting to experience. And with this one being such a long, battering experience, though, it certainly does become a very demanding album, especially when we take Andy Brown's comment to heart of listening to the entire thing in one sitting. But I think it's also oddly funny in terms of its presentation as well, like a really funny thing to have done. Very interesting, very fascinating. So yeah, glad to have talked about Stable, Andy Brown, and the record label Venalism. I hope you've enjoyed this one. Very long, very weird, but yeah, really wanted to talk about this one. I have to say, when it comes to Venalism, there's a lot of other ones I do want to discuss as well. One that we do have the review written up for, just got to make it right. We'll see. But yeah, we'd like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music. If you want to check out Stable by Cherries by Stable, the link is in the description below, as well as to Venalism, the record label. So yeah, I wish you all the best. Take care. Bye bye for now. Bye bye.